Hello and welcome to our tutorial series on how to master Google Admin Console. My name is Leon. I'm a Google certified trainer and administrator at the company called Cloudwise, the creators of the Cool School platform. And here at Cool, we help schools on how they can use IT within education. And in this series, we would like to share our knowledge and experience with you on how to set up and manage your Google Admin Console for your school. In this particular video, we will cover how to manage Chrome and Chrome devices. If your school uses Chromebooks, for example, and uses your Google account within the Chrome browser, it's very important to know what the settings are that you can do or privileges you can give your users, but at the same time also what kind of restrictions do you want to put on your users and devices. There's a distinction between users and devices as well, and of course we will cover all of that within this video. If we want to manage our Chrome policies, we have to go to Devices on our dashboard. So Devices we will find here. And when we go to the Devices overview, we will find some general information about our mobile devices and endpoint management, but we have to go to Chrome specifically, and then we have several things. And what we will go into in this video is the settings. Settings, you will find it already makes a distinction between users and browsers, device, and managed guest sessions. Let's start off with explaining why users and browsers is a separate way to set policies. Now, users and browsers, with users I think you can already have an idea of how that works. The moment your user logs into their Chrome browser and syncs their settings, then that means that their passwords, any policies, extensions, and their bookmarks will all be loaded within their Chrome browser that they are at that moment using. We can, however, also make sure that we enroll our browsers even without a user being logged into them, to make sure that we can set certain policies on those browsers, regardless of whether or not a user has been logged into them. This can be very useful to do when you have certain devices that have a general purpose that are used by a lot of different people, but you want to set certain restrictions or maybe just push an extension by default to every device. So in that way, you could also manage your browsers. With devices, we mean Chrome devices. So by default, this will mean that we mean Chromebooks, Chrome bases, and Chrome boxes. Our devices and device settings are all set to the device, which sounds logical, but it is important to reiterate. This is something that changes the way the device works, regardless of who logs into them. This is important to keep in mind. If there are certain settings that overlap with what your user requires, the device settings will overrule the user settings. It's important to keep in mind. Then we have managed guest sessions. And managed guest sessions essentially means we put the device into kiosk mode. A kiosk mode means that this is something where, regardless of whether or not someone is part of your organization, they can go into a guest session, meaning they can use your device without having an actual account of your organization. This is incredibly useful for when you, for example, have a library or just a general room that's being used with devices for people to use. The managed guest sessions have as a benefit you don't have to log into them in order for you to make use of the device to, for example, browse the internet. But the reason you would want to set this up instead of just making sure that the guest session, the normal guest session, is enabled, is that you can set restrictions on this. You can say, for example, how long such a session would take and what kind of things people can or cannot access while using this session. So that was a brief introduction into the different types of settings we can do. Then we will simply start off with users and browsers. Now that we have arrived at our users and browser settings, you will find an incredible long list of all kinds of settings we can set for our users and browsers. We can easily switch between what kind of settings we want to change, whether it is for users and browsers, devices, or managed guest sessions, by simply clicking one of these tabs. Each of these tabs has their own settings, so keep in mind that there are a lot of them. I will not cover nearly all of them within this video, and maybe I will actually make multiple videos in the future in regards to certain settings to combine them in a theme. For now, I will go over a few of the most important ones to at least know about. So a few things that we will find is how can we set a custom wallpaper, something that is displayed on every user's background if they use, for example, their Chromebook or other Chrome device. Do we set a customized avatar, something that has been set for people instead of having them choose an avatar themselves for in their Google account? You'll find things about sign-in restrictions and options, whether or not you're allowed to sign in to your browser, or maybe you force a user to sign in to their browser. Forcing a user to sign in to their browser, meaning to their Chrome browser, will mean that they will have to sync their settings, their extensions, and all of their other account associated data to that device, at least for the time being, for the moment that they are using it. This is beneficial when you have set a lot of things up and you really want to make sure that your students, your employees really get the benefit of everything we have set up for them through the admin console. If we go further down, we have a few things like our device enrollment. Enrolling a device means that the moment we start using our Chrome devices, we want to actually make sure they are enrolled in our own environment, that they are visible within our Google Workspace domain. And when we start enrolling devices, by default it will be added to our root layer, no matter who enrolls them. But we can decide to instead choose that a Chrome device is placed within the user organization when we enroll a device. I will not cover device enrollment in this particular video, but again, if you want to see that in the future, do let us know in the comment section down below. Going further down, we have links to apps and extensions and application settings page. Again, these are separate videos you can watch at a later time. If we go further down, we get to the password manager and all kinds of other things that have to do with security. Now, I find that mostly lock screen and the idle settings are important to cover. Now, if we go over this for a moment, the lock screen essentially means that the moment that we want to just leave our device unattended for a moment, that we normally would lock our screen, meaning we require a password to log ourselves back into the device and into our profile. If we do not allow this, that is not the default, by the way, but if we do not allow this, that makes sure that either you have to completely lock yourself out of your Chrome device, or you stay logged in. And this ties into the idle settings. Now, what we tend to do is to go and set the idle settings to, for example, a lot longer than the default. So in this case, I will set it to, let's say, 45 minutes. Then what should happen when the device has passed the idle stage? What if a device hasn't been used for 45 minutes? Then, by default, you will find that it is set to sleep. I usually set it to log out, and I don't use lock screen because, of course, I have disabled this. Now, why would I do it this way? Of course, I can set different settings per organizational unit, but let's say that this will be the default. If we have a Chrome device, a Chromebook, for example, then I have found that usually it's way more beneficial and a lot easier for students, especially younger students, to simply not have to think about what happens. That either they have forgotten to log themselves out, they are logged out automatically, or when they close their lid of their Chromebook, that they are automatically logged out, instead of that they simply return it back into the charging rack or the charging case and forget about it altogether until another student comes in and takes the device out and tries to log themselves in, because either it will be set to sleep or log out. And what do we do when we return from our sleeping state? We can also set this up. By default, you will find that after sleep, it will be set to lock screen, but we can also set it to don't lock the screen after sleep. In this case, that would actually be more beneficial. Now, in this case, I am doing it on a root level. And as I just briefly mentioned, we can of course set these settings all on our organizational unit levels. Given that we do this for users and browser settings, also be mindful of the organizational unit that you put this on. So in this case, I will probably set this up for students. It's best to first go to your students organization before setting any of these settings, because these will be inherited down all your organizational units, unless you, on a sub-level, determine that it is not inherited. Again, we get back to organizational unit structure. Now, I would always prefer to go to the District B setup so that we in one go set the student settings for our entire organization in one go. So here I will go and set it to 45 minutes. I will not lock the screen. What we also have done is disallow the incognito mode. Incognito mode allows you to essentially open a new tab, but without you being logged in to your current account. There are cases where it is very useful that you are able to do so. I find that as an admin, I make a lot of use of it, because sometimes I just want to check, if I go to this page, do I get the same issues maybe as I had before with my own account? Now, incognito mode can be very useful for that kind of function. However, for your students, I would never allow incognito mode. The problem with the incognito mode is that, for example, browser history is not saved. Any apps that you would want to be able to be used by your students don't usually work well with the incognito mode. Many extensions, for example, do not support being used in incognito mode or need additional privileges to run that way. I would never suggest to a school to allow incognito mode for students unless you have a very good reason to do so, because there is a specific application where you want the students to be able to use the incognito mode for. In the same line of thinking, we can also make decisions on whether or not we allow them to always save their browser history or not, and whether or not they can clear their browser history themselves. Again, these are things that I would always set to save and that they do not allow clearing their own browser history. If anything happens in the future and you want to recover whether or not in that situation something strange or bad happened, it can just be really useful to be able to look that back up in their history. Then force ephemeral mode. Now, ephemeral mode essentially means that no local data is stored, at least after we've logged ourselves out. So what does this mean? Regardless of whether or not you are logging yourself into your Chrome browser or your Chrome device, when using this setting, it will make sure that when we are done and we completely log ourselves out, that nothing will remain on our device. This means that every time that we close the browser, anything that we have done, anything that has been saved, any local data of our profile is then removed. Again, this is very useful when we use our devices and our accounts in a way where we don't want to store any local data and want to be able to use these on different devices without ever having to wonder and think about whether or not we need to clean them up at a later time, and whether or not any of the data that gets left behind might actually be a data privacy or security breach. I will go over device settings as well, and we can also do something like this on device level. So you may want to think about whether or not you do this on user and browser or device level instead. So when we get to startup, we have a few things that I think are useful at least to know about, especially for starting Google admins. So one of the things that you might want to do is make sure that your students and your users can very easily get to certain pages. Maybe set a default home page, for example. Instead of letting the user configure this themselves, we can also set a URL for them. Do we want the home button to always show up, or is this something the user can decide on? If we would set a home page as a URL, for example, the school web page, then of course we would prefer to have the home button always be displayed, so we can tell our users that they can simply click on the home icon and then be redirected to the page. What kind of page should open when we open a new tab? Do we want page suggestions to open? Do we want a certain background to be set, or can they customize this themselves? But also, when we log in, when we start up our device, when we have authenticated ourselves, whether it is in your browser or within your Chrome device, what pages should be loaded. Now in this case, when my students log in, automatically our cool page will be open to make sure that just when they log in, immediately their startup page will be cool. This doesn't have to be restricted to just one page, however, because we can just simply create multiple lines of URLs and all of those will be automatically opened the moment that this user logs in. Then let's go over content. So content, we will find a few things like safe search and restricted mode. And these have to do with our Google search queries and how we can find videos within YouTube. Now, the safe search is quite a nice thing to at least add to your security or the way that your users interact with the internet. Because when we enforce safe search, it means that certain explicit content will be filtered from search results. When we restrict or use the restricted mode for YouTube, then this means that we can set it to moderate, strict, or we do not enforce restricted mode. This will filter certain content, or at least make sure that certain content cannot be displayed, cannot be played when going and visiting YouTube. How this is exactly categorized is sometimes a bit difficult to know. So you could go about this by simply saying, I'm going to restrict everything, or at least have a very heavy restriction. And then you will have teachers and students tell you, hey, suddenly I cannot watch my video, even though this was a video that actually had educational purposes. Then you can scale it down to moderate restrictional mode. And if you still don't have the issues, you can, of course, lift it entirely. We find that the restricted mode for YouTube has less of an effect than just actually enforcing the safe search for Google, because on YouTube, yes, of course, you will find a lot of content that you might not want to use for education. There is a lot of entertainment on YouTube, and it's very easy to get distracted. It would be a lot easier to manage as a teacher within the classroom, either by just walking around the classroom or using a tool that helps you monitor your students. Now, if we go further down, we also have other things like, do we automatically allow cookies from certain web pages? Do we allow images, JavaScript, notifications, autoplay, and if they can even use Flash? Now, as many of you probably know, Flash is no longer supported, but there was a time where we could set certain pages up to make sure that Flash was automatically allowed. The same goes for other things like pop-ups. Certain web pages may involve having pop-ups opening. By default, a user will need to agree to open the new window as a pop-up. And instead, what I could do here is set up certain pages and make sure that automatically, if a pop-up would be opened, that there is no extra step for the user to take. What we will also find here is a way to block URLs. Now, URL blocking is actually pretty simple. The whole point of this is that if there are certain web pages you don't want your users to visit, we can put them in here. Now, this is something that is hard to keep track of when you have a lot of web pages you want to block. If you have a lot of content that you want to block, please don't do it here. This is a lot better to do for just a few web pages of which you know that the students want to go to. More often, I find that if a school finds it very important to keep track of what the students are visiting and what they can or cannot access, then you find a way to do and set up a certain type of content or DNS filtering. Another way to go about this is that also within the monitoring feature that we provide within Cool is to dynamically set up a black or white list instead, so that you can check per class that you're giving what kind of pages are actually accessible and which ones are prohibited. These are at least some of the few important ones I really wanted to mention in regards to user settings. There are, of course, a lot more settings to cover about users, but I will quickly go more in depth into device settings now and make sure that I have some time in this video left to make sure that I can also implore upon you what kind of things we can set up for devices. So under device settings, we can do a few things that are different from user and browser settings. Like I mentioned before, things that we set on a device setting is something that will be enforced even with a user that might have more privileges. It's important to know that. Starting off with a few things that I wanted to point out that are immediately at the top of the page. Forced re-enrollment. Now, enrolling a device means we add it to our Google environment so that we can manage it. That's great. The moment that we power wash it, that we wipe it, normally what it means is that we delete all our local data off the device. Again, that's great. Sometimes that's actually a fix for some of the issues you might experience. However, if we haven't set a device to be automatically re-enrolled after wiping, that means that we can no longer track what happens to the device. What that essentially means is that they are very vulnerable to theft, and a student that uses it, for example, could very easily wipe it themselves if we allow this to be done. Now, to prevent that, really make sure we force the device to be automatically re-enrolled after wiping, and after that it will be available to use again. Another thing that might be very useful to know is that if we disable a device that has been enrolled, which means you can no longer use it essentially, we just block any access to the device, we can set a customized message in here. For example, thank you so much for finding our Chromebook. It would be very nice if you would deliver it to the Cloud Street 35. If you don't want to bring it personally, do let us know. Here's our phone number and contact us. We'd love to pick it up. Then sign-in settings. Again, a very important one to cover in regards to device settings. Guest mode. I talked about that very briefly. Normally, if we use guest mode, this means that we simply can log in without using a Google account in our Chrome device. Now, doing so, we have no restrictions that we can set. It is really just, you are free to use the device however you want. You can go unrestricted on the internet. The only thing, of course, is that any Google apps you might want to use, still you would need to authenticate with a Google account. However, later on, if something has happened during that guest mode, we can actually not find anything in regards to what happened. That's why a managed guest session and setting up settings for it might be a lot better if we want to make sure that people can make use of some public devices. If we set up sign-in restrictions, that means that we can decide whether or not just about anyone can log into our device. So that also means people who just have a Gmail account, for example, a commercial account, or that we restrict it to a list of users. Now, mind you, restricting it to a list of users can also simply mean that we add a domain by simply starting with the asterisk, then the @ and the domain name. By doing this, we enforce that only student and Google accounts from your organization can make use of this device. The autocomplete domain simply means that the moment that we try and log into our Chrome device, the domain name will automatically be added as a prefix. This means that we don't have to fill in the domain, in this case edu.cloudwise.nl, but just the prefix, so our username, and then we can continue filling in our password after that. This can be very nice, especially when you have a more elaborate domain name for your accounts to use, and simply saves a bit of time when we go and log in with our account. We can change how the sign-in screen looks. By default, it will be set to always show usernames and photos. So if there are Google profiles that are still saved on your device, you will see the usernames and the profile pictures displayed on the sign-in screen. You can click one of them and then you only need a password to log yourself in. Point is, however, that the moment that we do it this way, if we have a device that is being used by a lot of people, then it will actually not add a lot of value. Imagine that 11 different students have used the same Chrome device. All those profiles are displayed on the home screen. Not only might you not want to have this happen, that you can simply see, who was the previous user, but at the same time, it is something that actually doesn't add anything when you have to go and search through the entire list again, see which one was mine again. Then it already beats the purpose. This is something that is useful when you have a device that is being used by a small amount of users. Then device off hours, I feel like, is actually very important, especially in regards to the sign-in restriction. Why is that? Okay, so as an example, you at your school have done a one-on-one project. Every student gets their own device. However, you want to set certain privileges and restrictions on those Chrome devices and how they work, because within your school environment, there are certain things that they have to adhere to. If we don't do that, then you will find that your teachers have a hard time actually keeping a grip on the initiative during the classes that they teach. So we have set sign-in restrictions to only allow sign-in to the Google accounts of school. But then these Chromebooks have been offered in the lease construction, meaning that at the end of their school period, the end of their school journey with you, they will actually own the devices. Or maybe even they immediately paid for the entire, or they paid entirely for the device in one go. Then they already own the device. And I have heard that this becomes an issue for a lot of people, that suddenly this is now a device that I own, but my school actually can set the rights on this and can change it, and I cannot change the way it works, and I cannot use it for my private work or any private usage. Then changing the device off hours is something that really helps. What this simply means is making sure that the moment we set this up, that outside of these hours, or rather inside of these hours, our students are free to use a personal account. They can use their private Gmail account and are not restricted to only their school account. On their personal account, they have all the freedom they would like, because all the restrictions that we have set to the user account for the school is not something that then is in effect. Effectively then, you can use it privately. And if we simply set it that after school hours, so after the school day, and for example before 7 o'clock in the morning, I don't know how early your school starts, then you in that case make sure that we actually have this covered. In a holiday, for example, then maybe you will want to move the devices into a specific organizational unit where we have said that there actually is not a login restriction at that organizational unit. Make sure that any devices you put in there automatically will be free to be logged in with a Gmail account or any other account for that matter. Here again, we also can set a device wallpaper image. We can decide here, as we can for the user, whether or not we want to erase the local data. The difference here is that with the user empirical mode, we make sure that if we do it that way, every time I close the browser, my data is removed. When I change it here with user data, this makes sure that every time an account has locked themselves out, everything is removed. The entire profile is removed, making sure that every single time a new user opens the Chromebook, they immediately get a clean environment in front of them. No traces left behind from any previous users, and that will also prevent, for example, the cluttering that we might have if we have the sign-in screen with usernames and photos. If you have alternative ways of logging yourselves in, you might have these settings filled in. For example, if you want to use our picture or QR login, then you will have probably set these settings for SAML and single sign-on settings. We have some sign-in screen accessibility settings. What kind of things do we allow to be used in terms of accessibility settings and functionalities before a user has been logged in to this device? Spoken feedback, select to speak, high contrast, screen magnifier, all kinds of things that might help certain students with specific needs. The same also goes for device update settings. Now, there may be times when there is a new functionality that is implemented in a new Chrome OS version. This may be an issue later down the line because we find out that certain applications suddenly have a small hiccup. This is usually resolved within the next patch and in a very short amount of time. We can set whether or not we allow updates automatically. We can restrict it to a certain Chrome version. That essentially means that we pin it to a current version and not allow them to update past that point. We can scatter the updates or roll out over a specific schedule. This essentially means that within our entire fleet of devices, how do I want to schedule this? How do I want to spread this? Scatter update essentially means that, in this case randomly, over 4 days time, all of our devices will download and install their new update. Now, the great thing about the Chrome update is that they download it and install it on the background while a user has been logged in, or even when the device is simply turned on and has access to the internet. The next time that you turn off and turn on the device again, it will boot the updated version of your Chrome OS. So there is no install time or any transition time that you have to take into account in regards to updates on your Chrome OS devices. By default, you will probably use stable channel as release channel, meaning that anything that has been properly and thoroughly tested is the Chrome OS version that you will receive. However, you may actually want to check out the upcoming Chrome OS versions by adding a few into a organizational unit that you specifically use for specifically checking what new versions will do. Now in the stable channel, we can also decide to go for beta or the dev channel. If we set this up for a organizational unit, specifically beta, for example, and put a few Chrome devices in there, then ahead of the schedule of the normal releases, we can already see what the changes will be that are going to be implemented for everyone. But we see that ahead of time, which also prepares you as an admin, but also your teachers and other staff to know what kind of changes are coming, and you can help them with that. Now, in this video, I'm not going to go over the managed guest sessions and kiosk mode. I will do that in a separate video. So now we have covered a lot of things in regards to how we can manage our users and browsers and, of course, our Chrome devices. If you want to change, for example, whether or not a device can use the webcam and speakers or any other kind of hardware, that is something we do on the device settings as well. These kinds of things I might cover in a future video in regards to security and things you may want to do in regards to setting up devices for an exam. But for now, I think I will keep it at this. The same, of course, goes for the managed guest sessions and the kiosk modes. Again, these will most likely be future topics we will cover on this channel. For now, at least I hope you get an idea of what kind of things are important to at least look at in terms of managing your users and browsers and your devices. I think that these at least are some of the basic things every admin should know about when you go and manage your Chrome devices and users. An important thing to note, of course, is the choice between whether or not you want to set up your rules and restrictions in a way that blocks everything, or rather that you want a more flexible ad hoc situation within the classroom itself. This will always be something that will be kind of in strife with each other. Either we have a situation where we have it completely secured and we have complete control versus a situation where we are completely free to do as a teacher to do within the classroom what we want and have access to whatever we need whenever we need it. You will always have to look for a situation that benefits both you as an admin and the teachers as well, so that they can teach, but also that it remains manageable for you. For that reason exactly, I also pointed out that, for example, blocking individual URLs within the Google Admin Console, please don't do that. It is going to be a lot of work for you and doesn't really actually yield you that much. If you want a way to make sure you block certain content, go and look for a content filter or a DNS filter to make sure that you would do it that way, which is a way more effective and a lot easier to manage. But if it is just at certain moments you want your users not to be able to use YouTube, for example, while in another class you want them to be able to use YouTube because then videos will be shared which have educational value, then maybe you should look for something else, like a way to do classroom management while you are teaching. In that regard, I would highly recommend you to check out our monitoring feature within the Cool portal. You can try out Cool for free, so definitely worth checking out. For now, I think I've covered how to manage Chrome within the Google Admin Console. If you liked the video, do let us know by liking it and subscribing to our channel. If you would like to stay updated on any of your future videos, also make sure you turn on the notifications. Do you want to see a certain topic that we should cover on our channel? Let us know in the comments down below. We plan to do an upload every week, so stay tuned for more short how-to videos. Thank you so much for watching. My name was Leon, and I will see you in the next video.